Okay, so hi again. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers that will be discussing mandatory decentralization. So we have remotely Henrik Axelsson, who is a PhD fellow in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Copenhagen, focusing his research on blockchain and DLT and their application to governance, business, and industry. We have also remotely Kelsey Navan, who is a researcher in decentralized technology communities. She's currently doing her PhD in Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University's Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society, as well as undertaking research in the Digital Ethnography Research Center and Blockchain Innovation Hub. And right by my side, last but definitely not the least, Rafael del Castillo Leonov, who is a blockchain lawyer and a professor at the Universidade de São Paulo, with a wide experience in advising, participating in Web3 and DeFi projects. So the first roundtable left us with, as Anna said, a lot of food for thought. The decentralized issues have obviously already been somehow touched upon. And something that was said in the first panel was that, well, it is very, very difficult to actually to come across a DAO that meets these three elements. The decentralization, the autonomous, and the organization part. And in this roundtable, what we aim to focus on is how can we assess, even admitting that's possible, what is decentralization? Just trying to ensure that we have actual DAOs and not, as Peter said, DINOs, decentralized in name only. So, Kelsey, I will start by you. Sorry, I don't know exactly where to look at. Considering that decentralization is not at its core a legal concept, do you think that regulation should depend on sufficiently decentralized assessments? Can we even regulate, can we even define what is decentralization?
Thank you, Madalena, and thanks everyone for listening in. So to point out, I mean, this is a conference about regulation, and I am not a lawyer. I am an ethnographer, so I study the kind of social and cultural dynamics of decentralized technology communities. And so first of all, I would point out that the concept of decentralization in this setting is not just an architectural one, it's really a political one as well. So, I have sort of quotes in my research about, political aims via technological means. So there's sort of ideological undertones, and the previous panel, touched on that a little bit about libertarianism, although I'd say that decentralized technology communities are much broader and more heterogeneous than just that as a political leaning. But these ideas and subcultures influence the concept of decentralization and how that's expressed and what's actually seen as aspirationally important and also kind of practically viable. And so what the policy idea of sufficiently decentralized conveys into that sort of context is really that, something potentially exists, which is quote unquote decentralized in some manner in terms of like not having the external political influence, but that also complies with the law. And so that's, I think, a really important edge to explore in this conversation, because the risks and the fear of liability is a massive barrier to founders that want to, develop projects in this space.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, that's very interesting what you said, risk-wise. And Henrik, now I'm thinking of you. The final MiCA text appears to treat decentralized activity in a matter that is similar to the US in a sense, where it is possible to conduct regulated activity if one is sufficiently decentralized. And in the Voters Clover post, you wrote that, and I'm quoting you, as follows: designing a decentralized crypto-based business model based on smart contracts is complicated. In addition to the usual challenges, founders must seek to operate their projected businesses in a decentralized manner or risk regulatory implications. Eric, having this risk in mind, in your view, when is a DAO sufficiently decentralized? I know this is a very hard question, but I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think, I mean, we researched this last year, and this was with coming out of MiCA and Recital 12, which says that if you are fully decentralized, then the regulation does not apply, but it does apply if you're partly decentralized. So I guess every regulator in the EU member state were looking at this, and we thought it would be an interesting way to look at how could you apply a filter to this concept if you were a regulator. So, so we worked through a lot of academic papers, and I interviewed a lot of experts in DAOs. And I used to be a lawyer myself. Now I'm doing computer science, but the idea was that there must be some way to do this. And I guess that the way we came to it was, okay, if the MiCA comes into force, you have 5,000 DAOs, and then you have regulators who are not at all equipped to deal with this concept. DAOs may be doing stuff that they think is regulated, the regulators, and vice versa. So it was an idea to see what is it actually that you should think about. And we came up with a definition of this, taking a systems engineering approach, which basically is very much sort of token engineering wise. So if you can compromise a critical component of a DAO, then you risk compromising the whole DAO. And then that means basically you're no longer sufficiently decentralized. So I don't think it's totally equal to the US. Well, I actually don't really know where the US is these days, but at least they had discussed a safe harbor concept, which would give you, I think, in some of the proposals, 2 years to become centralized. So the thinking is that it's a continuum and it's a journey, which I guess is very much aligned to how I also see it. But the definition we came up with was that sufficient decentralization is then a verifiable state where the design is collusion resistant and it's also based on long-term equilibrium. And the governance process should have unrestricted and transparent access. And the collusion resistance was basically avoid centralized attack vectors. But if a regulator would look at a DAO at any point in time, and since MiCA does not introduce a safe harbor timeline, we thought it would be, from a risk perspective, worth thinking about, is it designed for long-term equilibrium and being on a journey, or and then from a sort of risk-based supervisory perspective, maybe allow this potentially not fully decentralized DAO to still operate with regulated activity. And on the other hand, taking a risk-based approach and realizing they don't have the competency to analyze this at length anyway, where should they focus, which would be sort of the obvious cases where particularly big or DAOs doing activity that would become perceived a threat to financial policy objectives could then be focused. So that was where we came from. So we developed this framework, which was a lot of interviews with a lot of people who know much more about it than me. And then we basically clustered all these themes. And so we ended up with 5 themes, which we call the Tiger framework. So it's T for token weighted voting and incentives. The I is infrastructure, the G is governance, the E is escalation, and the R is reputation. That's more sort of, okay, well, at least we can remember it then. And under each of those, there was 3 headings sort of, and this is very much looking at centralized attack vectors or central controlling actors or abuse of power positions or legal holistic behavior, misalignment, that sort of stuff. And yes, I also realized that the previous panel said that there is no DAO that aspires to this, but actually in the paper that we published, we did actually look at one DAO, and we ended up saying that it actually could be perceived as sufficiently decentralized using this way. This was a way to look at it. It's not the right or the perfect way. I think we needed the technical standard to develop. but at least it was an attempt to understand what are the dimensions of decentralization and when could you possibly be sufficiently decentralized. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Harry. Very, very interesting. And you mentioned the safe harbor concept. And this takes me to Rafael. It's been said here today that all DAOs begin centralized. The process of decentralization is a process. Founders relinquish control over time. And another thing is that decentralization is necessarily assessed at a given point in time. So when we look at MiCA and we know that it excludes activities or services that are performed in a fully decentralized way, and Harry was somehow talking about this, does this mean that are we on a path to decentralization? What does this actually mean? Do you think that this way of regulating creates legal uncertainty to DAOs? I mean, it is difficult for us lawyers to understand how DAOs are regulated. I imagine that founders, every community members will find this very challenging.
Okay, definitely yes, it's really a problem. We have seen from the practice, if we have been for several years in the industry, a tendency to try to circumvent regulation. That's a fact, because well, startups are in a very challenging environment, and financial regulation or regulation in general is quite complex, it's quite costly, and it's quite also dangerous from a liability perspective. If we think about 5 years ago, well, everybody was launching ICOs and it was okay. Then all of a sudden, regulators thought that, listen, you're issuing securities, and people tried to change it. Okay, we're issuing utility tokens. Then we saw a wave of regulators popping in and saying, we have to requalify what you say are utilities and they are securities. Then people say, okay, we had the boom of the NFTs, and NFTs are not securities. And we have seen that some changes were made to MiCA to include also NFTs, but they're kind of outside if they're like a financial instrument. And what we've seen now in structuring projects is that even advisors will try to say, let's incorporate the DAO and that's it. And but there's no liability, in kind of the sense that if distributed responsibility is no responsibility at all. It's impossible to attribute. So let's deploy this in a DAO, and then the DAO do this. And as you cannot identify who is behind this, then nobody's liable. So this is a little bit the approach of structuring and say, it's not regulated, it's decentralized, and nobody is participating there. So I think the problem is that maybe advisors, maybe projects, they're trying to forget and not think about they should be regulated. And I will maybe address some points which are part of the next panel, but I think all of the panels are touching different points. I think we have to think, one of the most clear discussions we usually have with colleagues is, do we need a special entity, some new legal person, whatever, to regulate DAOs, to give it some structure? And I think we have to, before thinking about what are DAOs, we should think more about the principles. And there are two main principles and build from there. First principle is the technology neutrality. It's something I heard from the FINMA 7 years ago when I was asking them, and they told me, don't look at what you are at the technology, forget technology. Look at what's behind this technology, what's happening, what are the human interactions and legal interactions happening behind all this situation. Second main principle we sometimes forget is the freedom of contract. So, ubi societas EBU. So we take the societas as a contract, and then we can discuss if it's civil partnership, whatever. We can go there. This is a contract which is giving some organizational rules and governance rules. And it's the freedom of contract of the integrants of this organization which are doing this.
Well, do you mind if I interrupt you? I would say regarding those two topics, I have great doubts if the principle of technology neutrality is actually a good principle. I know that we have to look to the materiality of the situation, to what's really behind, but I do not think, well, I'm only moderating, but I have some doubts if technology is actually relevant if it shouldn't play a role in the qualification of the underlying situation, of the underlying organization.
We have seen, I think, if we see the last DAO, what happened to DAO is that when a judge receives a case, they have to rely on at least in continental law to what they already have in the system. And if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. So it's the principle they apply even if you don't have anything else. So I guess we are doomed to have to live with the situation where when all this ends up in court, it's already happening. We're seeing this. I think judges will try to apply this principle and say, what does it look like? What's what?
But don't you think that may be harsh for some DAOs that are on a path towards decentralization, but are at the point in time not yet sufficiently decentralized, and their tokens may be qualified as securities, and they will be bound by every financial regulation, prospectus regulation, market abuse regulation?
I agree with you, definitely, yes. The DAOs are now facing very complex regulatory framework and difficult perspective. Another point of that's why I'm advocating to try to use a legal wrapper or to incorporate or to look for some solution, because otherwise the DAOs are facing lots of risks because, well, you can be attracted. The globalization means that participants from all over the world, you don't know which jurisdiction may attract part of this to the courts and create liability for all the members. So I think living in an unregulated world, unincorporated world for DAO is very risky. And they should try to use these principles and see and choose wisely the best jurisdiction, the best legal wrapper to kind of protect a little bit their operations.
Yes, definitely. Enrique, Rafael just mentioned the existence of legal wrappers and that in somehow it may be advisable to have a legal wrapper in some situations. Do you think the mere existence of a legal wrapper means or necessarily means that the DAO is not decentralized? Because we can identify a point of control in the governance structure.
This was addressed to me, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, like Rafael, I think I've always thought compliance is a blessing to those who are not able to operate in accordance with expectations from other stakeholders, including regulators. So, and I also struggle with the concept of DAOs having an unfair advantage for doing stuff by flying below the radar. So ideally, if you want to become the future rails of finance and interoperate with the traditional world, I don't understand why you would not also want to be legally incorporated. You can't be a libertarian anarchist and do your own stuff. You still need to be interacting with the real world. I think there's a lot of DAOs that do fantastic work, which is not financial services, but I think it's important that if they do, they think about the liability for it. And the legal wrapper, I've always actually saw it as an element of autonomy, which is basically legal capacity. And the whole decentralized community operation, more in the line of what Kelsey is looking at, I think was an attractive way to deal with transnational global reach and distribution and making great things for communities that are underserved. But actually, it's also a perfect transparent business model if you're tired of bureaucracy in the real world or in traditional world. So I think a wrapper is a centralized activity, and I guess it is in this context, if it's financial services, you're obviously becoming centralized, because the whole point of the sufficient decentralization conversation was that if you are sufficiently decentralized, the regulator don't have anyone to hold accountable, and I guess that's where it started. So I think it is a wrapper would be centralized in the context of a regulator, but I think there's a lot of activity and community operation you can still benefit from under a wrapper and get all the benefits of being a DAO. And I guess we're a little bit missing that if we're only talking legal stuff here.
Can I just jump in on that? Because there's a very pertinent and timely question here about where the boundaries of decentralized digital organizations actually exist. And that's with this recent trend for communities such as DAOs to constitute themselves. And so I should say I do a bit of work with Block Science, which is an engineering firm in the space. And we just put out a Medium post a couple of weeks ago with my colleague Michael Zargam and Eric Alston called "What Constitutes a Constitution?" And we're sort of posing this idea that the boundaries of decentralized organizations exist both in the legal wrapper that they might choose, as well as in the social documentation, like a manifesto or something that they write about who they are, that people sign with their wallet, as well as in the protocol itself. So it's this idea that because they're digital and digitally native organizations, they have this kind of constitutional infrastructure that they compose different elements of across the social, the technical, the legal, and so on. And I think the really pertinent open question here is like, what are the actual legal consequences of DAOs, coming together as a community and writing these constitutions? And following on from Henrik's comment, in the same way as actually just choosing a legal structure, does that bound the community in a certain way to regulators that makes them liable in a certain way?
Thank you, Henrik and Kelsey. Very interesting. And if I may just circle back to something you said before, Rafael. You said the very well-known phrase, "It looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it is a duck." But I would say, I don't know, I have a feeling that, an intuition if you want, that decentralization or the degree of decentralization can impact a way a DAO is legally qualified, legally framed. Because in the absence, in jurisdictions where we don't have legal frameworks, and Antonio was saying that in our opening speech, he said, generally the DAOs would be qualified as general or civil partnerships with the consequences we all know attached to it. But if a DAO is sufficiently decentralized, I mean, if it's actually a DAO and not a DINO, would you say we can identify coordinated efforts between participants, and can we identify joint exercise of an economic activity, which are elements that are crucial to defining a general partnership? Do you think that decentralization can impact, or the degree of decentralization can impact a DAO's qualification?
I would say two things. First idea is I'm not very sure if having a structure incorporated and having a decentralized management and operation of the structure, because what technology allows this and legal frameworks allow this to be done. Member managed LLCs by all the members or associations in Switzerland, which are community members doing what the forefront does. So I think we can achieve and try to find sufficient decentralization or full decentralization, even having a legal entity. That's first thought. Second thought is that
I think everyone who's listening to us is more relaxed now. Yes. Because after Eric's comments before, I don't know, I personally was a bit worried that having a legal wrapper would mean necessarily decentralization.
It would depend on the structure and how it's built and how it's framed. And I guess if the organization is made in such a way, and also the infrastructure is made in such a way that it's really decentralized, then I guess we could fit into this.
And see the legal wrapper as just
exactly
a point of connection to the
point of connection and also a point of definition. Because as I told you before, my first speech was about the risks. It was what you are saying right now. If we don't have a legal wrapper and we have a group of people doing a joint effort about something, and they then have this economic activity, then if we don't have anything else behind or support this, then we are a civil partnership, and then we have all the risks and what we saw in Hokidao approach from the judge. So if we take away this economic activity and to identify economic activity is pretty complex. How can we know if there is or there is not. Just by voting, is it economic activity? Sitting passively, is it economic activity? The tokens being traded somewhere, is it economic activity? So
What do you think?
It's very difficult. I would say that it's risky anyway. So if we are in for a non-profit, then we should aim at, and actually we don't have to do some formal act for incorporating the constitutions, and many countries allow us just a group of people doing something for non-profit association. And usually an association of people, they don't even need to have a formal incorporation. It's okay, it's good to be done. You have a tax number, you can act, you can open bank accounts and all of that. But the association would protect and would be this kind of legal wrapper for a non-profit. If you are going or looking for some economic activity, then of course we should think about other structures to protect the founders and protect the professional. That's at least my view.
Yeah, and that finding those structures is, as we all know, very, very challenging. So back to you, Henrik, if I may. In protocols where governance is operated via governance tokens, we have to deal with pseudonymity. I mean, it means that while tokens may be held by different public addresses, a single entity may in theory possess all such addresses and therefore all governing power. So other users would have no formal means to detect these points of control. In your opinion, should we, if we choose to regulate DAOs, should we address this problem? Is it even possible to address this problem? I don't know if you can hear me.
It's. I think if you want to regulate, I think regulators should sort of think about why are they here, and I think they should look at policy objectives. So I mean, if we're talking financial regulators in this case, I guess. So in financial markets, you need to have proper functioning and integrity of markets. You need to have financial stability, and you need to protect the interest of consumers and investors from a protection perspective, and reduce crime, and also preserve monetary sovereignty. I guess the latter one relates to stablecoin DAOs. But I think those are sort of the overarching top priority objectives, and I think also the Basel Committee aligns to that. Then there's something called innovation and global competitiveness as well, and I think at least in the EU with MiCA, that drives the whole digital finance package. And then so you have competing objectives, because we want to also be part of the we want to be innovative and globally competitive after not having been very good at it while the US was running with everything. In the blockchain space. And then I think there are some competing objectives here. So I would think that to regulate these activities, it has to be policy aligned. And if a pseudonymous actor, I mean, there are tools to figure out, blockchain is blessed with perfect evidence and transparency, and you can use tools to track, and Chainalysis and other great firms have already done quite a lot in this space on being able to track and understand if collusion is happening. And I think Srinivasan also developed the Nakamoto coefficient to measure this sort of from a mathematical statistical graph perspective. The framework we pushed forward last year for assessing decentralization looks at that dimension. And we introduced a component called, well, if you want to claim sufficient decentralization, you have to look at verifiably independent agents. You can, if it's not verifiably independent, well, then you don't know, because pseudonymous actors can then collude. So I would think that if you cannot verifiably say these are independent agents that are not colluding, well, then there's a high risk of being not sufficiently decentralized. And I think that it's a test that regulators will do, and they should be doing, so that you allow firms that are truly decentralized or aiming to become, you allow them to do that. Whereas those that are trying to escape compliance, I think it is not a well-deserved intent or purpose to have, and I fail to see it needs protection. similar to what Raphael mentioned. So I would use that saying, well, if you are independent and you operate independently and decentralized, of course, you shall have the benefits of being sufficiently decentralized. But if you're just trying to avoid regulation, it's not a good purpose.
First, thank you, and thank you for your explanation regarding the functioning of the possibility of having verifiable independent agents. And Kelsey, I know you have been doing a lot of research on the similarities or the potential similarities between DAOs and other forms of organizations, namely platform cooperatives. Is there something to learn specifically regarding decentralization to DAOs from platform cooperatives? Can you quickly summarize some of your ideas?
Yeah, I've had a look at what DAOs and cooperatives can learn from one another. That's a working paper that's publicly available on the internet, which I did with some co-authors in a Berkman-Klein research sprint. I've also looked at DAOs and data trusts, which is a publicly available working paper online as well. So to your question about co-ops, one sort of standout that really binds the cooperative community is that there are generalizable operating principles, namely around the definition of democracy in these contexts, where those that labor in the cooperative are those that own it. And I think it's worth pointing out that we're having these conversations about DAOs, but they're still a figment in terms of I think they're extremely evolutionary. They didn't really exist in practice a couple of years ago, and I think they're rapidly changing. And so not only can DAOs create for themselves kind of more defined principles about what they are, socially or politically, but also technically in terms of technical standards, to go back to what Henrik was saying about what is sufficient decentralization, but also regulators need to think about the ways that they're rapidly evolving. And Henrik mentioned in his last answer as well about agents and how do you determine, unique, separate identities that are operating in these systems that aren't going to collude. Well, we're just seeing the very beginnings of, auto GPTs and these kind of service-oriented AIs. That's a burgeoning area of research for me on regulation and accountability and self-regulation, and actually doing ethnographic research into how DAOs are utilizing ChatGPT type services and capabilities to govern, and whether that creates accountability or not. I guess I'll caveat the point on data trusts that, again, that relates to a completely different type of DAO. That's, data services, data marketplaces, where DAOs are kind of reaching for a legal wrapper, really, to cover what they're doing. And there are data DAOs that have incorporated through that. And I'd point people to look up the example of Superset, which was a project that Block Science has worked on.
Thank you, Kelsey. We definitely look forward to hearing your conclusions. And Henrik was previously mentioning that we have somehow two competing objectives. We should aim at protect consumers, but we also want to foster innovation and to welcome innovation, and to make sure that that regulation does not mean that innovation does not go on. So it is hard for me to find ways in practical life to ensure that these two objectives meet. Because if I'm worried about consumer protection and about token holders protection, for example, I would say that in a DAO, the existence of small groups of people that control the legality of the decisions that are being voted on chain, or that can veto illegal decisions that are being decided, or that some forms of vote delegation may be good, I don't know. But wouldn't this mean that I'm somehow centralizing my DAO, and I'm explicitly saying that I have points of control here and there? What do you think about this?
Definitely, yes. I mean, when we think about decentralization as like democracy, but as some other panelists told, you tend to try to achieve more centralization for operational efficiency. So basically, if you have this in place, we are switching to already known systems. When companies were incorporated, you have the governing body, and then you have the shareholders or the members. So, and they are deciding. It's kind of the same or very similar structure, even if it's not written like that. But those persons having this extra powers to decide, then they are kind of converting themselves like it's kind of a board, that's kind of a governing body who is directing and representing and acting on behalf of the others. So I think that's decentralization and unachieved.
Unachieved. So, but that's fun, because that would mean that financial regulation, for example, would be applicable to a DAO such as this.
I would say, well, it's difficult until the regulator sees what they. And what we have cases, yes, but I would assume that they use a very conservative approach usually, and for them protecting specifically when it's a large project which can be systematical from their perspective, they will tend to seek maximum protection. So, and that's bad for DAOs structured like that, and it's a risk again.
Yes, but what I take from that conclusion is that it is virtually impossible to balance these two general principles, because if I want to protect consumers and protect my participants, I will need, I think, I don't know, I would say I need some points of control. But if we have this opinion that those points of control necessarily mean or possibly mean that regulators will look at that DAO or that organization, not as a DAO, but as something else that is potentially regulated, that means that I cannot have a DAO that has points of control of legality. That's really, it's hard for me to accept. I don't know if you...
I agree with you, but again, if we are looking at this from a European perspective, and what usually happens is that our local regulators, they try to ask, when they don't know what to do, how to interpret something, they try to ask ESMA. And ESMA usually tries to see what's happening in the US because they're kind of more progressive or they have more experience, they've seen more. And what we have seen now in the US, what's happening is a crypto industry crackdown like never before. It's like, and it's expected, I would expect, unfortunately, that instead of Europe thinking to create a safe harbor for all those projects being incorporated in Europe and working from there, most probably, and it would be an unfortunate decision, what I guess will happen is that they will simply imitate the same approach to regulation, unfortunately. And then we will, all of the industry be in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, possibly. So we are on a tight schedule, so I would sum up Henrik, Kelsey, Rafael. In your opinion, what is to be expected regarding DAOs regulations, specifically regarding decentralization, or in general, with which ideas would you like our audience to be left with? Henrik, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, I think that, implement Mika, that would, I think if we reduce uncertainty, it's much easier to actually deal with the real problems instead of guessing. So I would have a good firm regulation so that we know what to expect, and then we can have lots of innovation because we remove regulatory uncertainty. So the more the merrier, and then we can all adjust. And again, I don't see a problem in being regulated. If you do regulated activity and you want to become the future rails of everything, then accept the fact that you live in the world and not in somewhere else.
That's a good idea. Kelsey?
Yeah, a few points just to reinforce. The first is that, decentralization to these communities is also a political objective, and it's around self-regulating. I don't fully necessarily subscribe to that, to Henrik's point. I do have some writing on this concept, which I call self-infrastructuring, which relates to the socio and technical dynamics of resilience in these communities as well, if anyone is interested in following those threads. Retroactive regulation won't work, not really something that we touched on today, but, very prime, I'm sure, in people's minds about recent events. And then the final point, just that DAOs are evolutionary. They're not in their final state, even if we're saying there are these things that progressively decentralize. So keep an eye out for AI agents in DAO governance and service provision.
Thank you. I learned a lot from you three. Thank you so much for being here today, for accepting this invitation. I don't know if we have space for a few questions of the audience. If someone wants to jump in, just 5 minutes. Is there anyone who has a pressing question? No.
I would like to hear about the views of points that I see the struggle between profit and non-profit, the organization of DAOs in foundation types of structures that sometimes have or appear to not have a for-profit approach, because decentralization may also need to the point of non-profit element, because we are all a community and what we want is the good of all and not the good of a few. Whilst the for-profit approach, we all know that it has a centralized element in it. So I would like to see what you have to say.
Any of the colleagues?
I don't know, Cassie and Henrik, I don't know if you could hear the question because the mic is on the table. Rafael, what if you want to...
Well, it's a good question. Thank you very much for it. Basically, to understand that, foundations or associations, they can conduct profit activities, but technically it's not what they are good for, and that's not what they were made for. Of course, when the project itself, and you have to see about what brought together this group of people to engage in this common objective and common idea. If it was to advance mankind, to do protocol which is better for the humanity, then it's one thing. But at the end of the day, most structures have some cost, so there has to be some element to sustain, to keep this, and okay, there are lots of projects, like we have seen it even before all this, like Wikipedia, which is people just because they would like to contribute, did it without expecting any profit. So yeah, the structure, as you talked about foundations or associations, again, the structures are necessary and they help. Of course, we have seen that people do foundations for tax reasons, and it's not the correct way maybe to do it. Some way you can do it. We've seen it in Switzerland a lot, but people just made foundations, and at the end of the day, they got funds like donations to avoid taxation, and then they kind of conducted directly or indirectly by having other companies which are doing this programming. So it kind of people are learning, people are evolving, people are trying to make sense of it. So I think it's a long way, and it's a process. So I think we will see where this leads us.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit provocative. Considering distributed nature of European Union and current political crisis that is happening, when different countries dealing with each other, and specifically case Poland against the European Commission, would you consider thinking not to regulate decentralization, but more decentralized regulation in this case?
How would, sorry, I'm not supposed to answer, but how would that work?
Because the European Union itself is a kind of great field for the decentralization, right? And if we can start to think about, okay, let's try to put this rigid regulation on these decentralized technologies, instead of trying to apply decentralization approaches and tax to create decentralized European Union, decentralized European Commission, working as DAOs, they'd like to create a new form of regulation that will fit different countries.
Peter, I think that's a suggestion.
My question, would you consider this? To change the mindset and start thinking about decentralizing regulation?
Well, it's decentralized politics. I mean, it's political science. I'm not pretty good qualified to do, even I have some part of studies of the political science degree. But the thing is about technology allows direct democracy, and technically, well, most of us Europeans, we think that some of the decisions do not represent us, or do not impose something. Well, we're getting things imposed which are very difficult to cope with the interest of different territories with different hub starting in Europe, and they have lots of direct democracy voting. Maybe we could, now that we have this technology, we could somehow foster more participation from people and try to. But again, we're talking about efficiency. I'm not sure if all of us have sufficient time to sit and read all these potential regulations, directives, and all these acts which are coming to force about, I don't know, agriculture. And it's just MiCA, the last reduction is 500 pages, and all of us are studying and trying to make the sense of it. So having 500 pages about everything would be difficult to make a qualified decision. But,
Thank you, Rafael. Great answer to a provocative question. Just to end this roundtable, because we are we are on our coffee break time. Just the question that was written in our Q&A chat for Eric or Kelsey, if you want to answer. Are there some good case studies of DAOs that solve the free rider problem well? Balancing act between incentivizing activity and penalizing free riders. I don't know if you can help, Kelsey, Eric, or Rafael, obviously.
Yeah, I'll share a paper in response to that answer, but I did a very deep dive case study into Gitcoin DAO, and how they actually regulate against Sybil attackers who want to create fake identities to garner more of the treasury in the funding mechanism. So that's called governance of algorithms, governance by algorithms. And it's about how they, in a decentralized context, had to create a machine learning pipeline, which is a very centralized process, and actually govern and maintain that function. And that research happened with large thanks to Block Science for access to that case study, and Gitcoin as well. So I'll throw you an answer to read more.
I think, Eric, if you don't want to add anything, are you okay?
No, I was thinking about that.
Okay, so thank you, all three of you. Thanks to our kind audience, and it's time for a coffee break. We need to gain strength for the next debates, next discussions. So when we leave the room, I think if you turn right, you'll find, I hope, an excellent coffee break, hopefully.